Okay, I want to speed on to chapter 7 because there's a couple of things I want you to notice. Firstly, I want you to notice two things about the structure, and that is he talks about different groups of people from chapter 7, verse 1, all the way to verse 16, and then verse 17 through 24. He kind of talks. He's on something else, but he's trying to talk about a principle, and that is be content with the way you are. And then 25, he's back again talking about engaged people and people who aren't engaged. So there's this structure in this passage. But the other thing I want you to notice, and I've got it up here so you can see it, is how the Apostle Paul in this chapter goes out of his way. Sometimes it's awkward, but he does it that whenever he talks about the situation of a man, he repeats it for the woman. Or if he talks about the woman, he repeats it for the man. A very deliberate, definite balance. Let each man, let each woman, the husband and likewise the wife's body, the husband's body, do not deprive except by agreement. You can have this later if you want to get this down, but it's all in the text. You can just observe it. To the unmarried, and then to the widows. Now, I'll talk about that verse in a moment. The wife should not separate, the husband should not divorce. Believer has a wife, any woman has a husband. The unbelieving husband, the unbelieving wife. To the brother, the sister, wife, husband, unmarried man, unmarried woman, and so on and so forth. I just draw your attention to that because it seems that he is really important to him to keep this balance. Now, if you have some translations, this brings us to the part of the letter where Paul is addressing questions that they raised, and I suggested to you that it wasn't simply a question, it was a bit more maybe confrontational. In other words, they were disagreeing with him. But he says, now concerning the matters about which you wrote, and again you'll notice the quote marks in their Bible. It is well for a man not to touch a woman. Now, some translate that as it is well for a man not to marry. And that's a bit of an unfortunate translation. Because the phrase, a man not to touch a woman, is actually talking about sex. We're talking about sex again. Now, the context for sexual activity for the Christian is marriage. So we can understand why people say that. But the focus here, I'm going to suggest to you, marriage is secondary. It's a sex thing that is going on here, and it's a contrast to the previous portion where people were reserving the right to engage in sex with prostitutes. That we have here probably women who were not wanting to have sex. And the reason is that this slogan is that it is good not to have sex. And the reason they would say that would be because of the over-realized eschatology, because of their understanding that as spiritual people who are living in the age to come, that in the age to come we don't engage in sex. We get a clue from this in Luke 23:29. There's this argument that the Pharisees had with Jesus, or this question. There's this man, and he had a wife, and he died, and his wife was married to his brother, and he died, and she was married to his brother, and it's a Levite marriage thing. And the big question: whose wife shall she be in heaven? Gotcha. See, and Jesus comes in and says, "Well, the problem is you don't know what you're talking about." which is very subtle. And what he says is that we'll be like angels in heaven. And what he's indicating is that there is not sex in heaven. Now, if they're going to be like angels in heaven, it would mean they're not married and they're not having sex. So in other words, you get here the opposite to the sexual license. You get the other side, the asceticism, arguing to be abstaining from sex, and connected to that would be, if we're not going to be acting like man and wife, then why should we stay married? Let's separate. Now, I say this as a background because as we read this, the Apostle Paul, in the first part of this particular chapter, seems to be addressing a specific instance. In other words, this is not just theory. There's something going on in the church he's addressing. And the same in the second part. It seems that there is, and this really comes from reading the way he words it carefully, a woman should not separate from her husband. And then later on in the chapter, it seems that there's an engaged couple and they're not knowing whether they should get married or not. The question is, should they get married? And so he's dealing with these specific things. But the way he begins is saying, they are saying, it would seem, it is well for a man not to touch a woman. Now the word in Greek for woman and the word for wife is the same. It's important you know that. Every time you read the word man or woman, it could be husband or wife, because there wasn't a separate word. So it is well for a husband not to touch his wife. It could be said here very, very easily. But he goes on to say, but because of the cases of sexual immorality, like just read the bit I've just written, because of the case of sexual immorality, each man should have, and that means sexually, should have his own wife. In other words, should have sex with his wife. And each woman, her own husband. So the celibacy within a marriage is not possible according to the Apostle Paul, and you may be pleased to know that. And verse 3, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights. In other words, have sex with her. And then notice he says it the other way round, and likewise the wife to her husband. This balance. And then what he says is really quite remarkable, actually, given the culture and given the attitude to women. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And all the people would say, yes, we understand that. That's the way it works. But then he says the same thing in reverse. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but his wife does. Well, that would not have been expected. Because in the mentality of many, part of the inferiority of women was that they were there for the man's sexual enjoyment. And the thought of it being the other way round was not something that would have been high on their thinking or their agenda. But what we see here is in the marriage bedroom, there's absolute equality between the husband and the wife. And when it comes to sex, sex is not about taking, it's about giving. It's about serving. And again, marriages can break up because what happens in the bedroom is the man ends up feeling he has a right to sex, and the sex he wants is for his pleasure. And after a while, his wife begins to realize, because women are very intuitive like this, that she's being used. rather than it being something that is really mutual. And then, just to be real blunt about it, if you add on to that the epidemic of pornography, which is sweeping the globe today, and men, how easy it is for men to get addicted to pornography, you bring that dimension in. He has a secret life of pornography, so when he does have sex with his wife, he's actually making love to the images in his brain. And his wife will pick up on that too. That's what happens. And so all of a sudden, this woman is feeling like, I'm being used. And so she will start withdrawing and not want to be involved with sex for that reason. And then when that happens, tension comes in. And you know what happens from then onwards. The marriage breaks down. What we see here, and this is what is so wonderful about God's way, is when it comes to sex in the bedroom, it's not you owe me, but I owe you. Completely different footing. It's the same, it's just kingdom principles. We're here to serve. Whether it's doing the washing up or whether it's in the bedroom. We're here to serve. That's a mentality. And so he's very strong on this. Do not deprive or defraud, verse 5, one another. And so he's talking here about the sex between the married couple. Do not deprive one another except perhaps by agreement for a set time to devote yourself to prayer. So the only reason to not have sex, according to Paul, is that you're praying. Sorry, dear, I want to have a prayer time tonight. Okay, I suppose so. And then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. And this is by way of concession, not a command. You don't have to have this a prayer thing. It's just as a concession. If you really want to be real spiritual and abstain from sex because you're having a time of prayer and fasting, then you can do that, as long as it's by agreement. And you're not just telling your spouse, tough. But then he goes on to say this, and I wish that all were as I myself am. But each to his own particular gift from God. One having one kind, another having another. Now, what you've noticed in this is that Paul has a very definite preference for celibacy. Paul is not married, and it seems he doesn't want to be. He's happy to be single, and he thinks it's a great life, and he would wish them to enjoy it too, but he recognizes not everybody's called to this. And so you get this beautiful tension where he says, well, I think you should do this, but you're free to do this. I think you should stay single, but if you marry, you don't sin, okay? It's not a sin to get married, but you're probably better if you do this. And you get this tension, and what Paul is doing is giving his preference, which he's free to do. Now, verse 8 is interesting because I've shown you the balance between the two all the way through the letter. He says, to the unmarried and the widows, I say it's well for them to remain unmarried as I am. In the Greek, there is not a word for a man who's lost a wife through death. That word doesn't exist. There is a word for a wife who loses a husband through death. So I would suggest to you that verse 8 is talking about people who have been married but lost their partners through death. To the unmarried and the widows, I say it is well for them to remain unmarried as I am. And there is an argument. Some people feel that the Apostle Paul was a widower. We have no evidence, apart from this possibly, and from the fact that in Jewish circles, because the Jewish people valued marriage so much, marriage is something was highly prized in Jewish society. For a rabbi not to be married was very, very, very unusual. And there was one unmarried rabbi that we have record of who felt he had to apologize for it and give a reason it was normal to be married. And so some have suggested that the Apostle Paul was a widower, because he says here, to the widowers and the widows, I say it's well for them to remain unmarried as I am. We don't know. It is possible. But if they are not practicing self-control, they should marry. It is better to marry than be aflame with passion. Very pragmatic. If you can cope with the single life, then I think you do well. If you can't, then get married. Very straightforward. Now, of course, it is the person you marry does matter, and it is good to pray and have wisdom in that marriage. But you just see what he's saying here. If you're able to cope with a single life, that's great. You'll do well. But if not, get married. And then to the married, I give this command, and then notice what he says, not I but the Lord. Now, what he's doing there, he's saying the command I'm giving you now is a command that Jesus gave. And in all of the synoptic gospels, twice in Matthew, he talks about divorce. You'll remember those passages. And the Apostle Paul is using this teaching, he's using Jesus' teaching as a basis for what he's about to say now. And to the married I give this command, not I but the Lord, that a wife should not separate from her husband, and if she does separate, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. Now we do need to know that in the Greek world, that to separate from your husband or to divorce your husband was the same thing. In our societies, there's two stages, isn't there? There's separation and then divorce. That didn't apply back there. Both are talking about divorce. And so very simply, he is talking about the command of Jesus that if you divorce your husband, then stay single, or be reconciled to your husband. That's possible. And the same for the husband. If he divorces his wife, he shouldn't do it, but if he does, it would be the same for him. Now, what he's doing is discouraging the breakup of marriages in the Church of Corinth, because some people, probably women, were feeling that to be more spiritual, they should be like the angels, they should not be married. And so what he's done is he's talked about two categories of unmarried people, of married people, those who have been married but are now no longer married, and those that are married. And now he's going to talk about a third category, and that is the rest. Verse 12. Now you may ask, what other category are there? You've had the married and lost their partners through their spouse through death, and those that are married and are thinking of divorce. The third category that Paul has here, the rest, are those that are married to non-Christians. So that's the third category of married people. You see the three categories. And to the rest, and then he says, to the rest I say, and then he goes on to say, I am not the Lord. Now, what this means is Jesus did not talk about this category of people, which tells us that when Jesus was speaking in the Gospels, he was talking about what we would call today believers that are married. Christians. And the apostle here now is addressing a category that Jesus didn't address. And that is Christian married to non-Christian. And this is what he says. And again, you get the balance. If any believer has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. Don't get divorced because you're married to a non-believer. Now you can imagine the pressure that might have been on some people. They come to Christ, their spouse doesn't, they're now spiritual people. What about that marriage? What about that relationship? And Paul says, if your non-Christian wife consents to live with you, do not divorce her. And if any woman, the balance here, has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. Very simple stuff. Jesus didn't speak about this category. I'm speaking about this category. If you're married to a non-believer and your spouse is happy to stay with you, then don't divorce. Stay as you are. For the unbelieving husband is made holy through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy through her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but it is, they are holy. Now this is not talking about the husband being automatically saved. What it's talking about is the argument, how can you be living with, how can you stay married to a non-Christian because you're holy and they're not, they're non-Christian. And Paul says no, that the marriage relationship is sanctified. It's a sanctified, holy marriage relationship, even if they're not Christian, because you are. And don't think negatively on your children either, because they are the result of a Christian, non-Christian coming together. They too are holy in the sense that the bond of marriage is a covering for them too. Okay, so it's not talking about people being saved or not saved just because of the marriage relationship. But, verse 15, if the unbelieving partner separates or divorces, let it be so. In such case, the brother or sister is not bound. It is to peace that God has called you. Now, here he says, there may be a situation where you're married to a non-Christian and they consent to live with you, and you carry on in your as a Christian. They don't, but they're happy for that. Then let that be the case. Don't divorce. But if your unbelieving spouse comes to you and says, you become a Christian, you're not like you used to be, I hate your new lifestyle, I want to get out of here, I want a divorce. What Paul says, let it be. That divorce should happen. And it should happen because God's called us to peace. And if that divorce doesn't happen, that relationship could become sour and embittered and be very destructive. Now, you probably not heard that talked about, but I believe that's what that's saying. Wrestle with it yourself. In other words, there's times when divorce, as tragic as it is permitted. Paul doesn't want it. He would say, no, don't do it. But there could be a situation when that relationship gets so awful and so terrible in the Christian, non-Christian situation that divorce should happen. And if it does, he says you are not bound. In other words, the marriage is over, and if you go to verse 39, the wife is bound as long as her husband lives, but if the husband dies, she is not bound. She's free to marry who she wishes. It would seem to indicate here that the Apostle Paul is saying, if the non-Christian walks away because the marriage relationship is so awful, then the Christian is free from that marriage and not bound. In other words, they're free to remarry. Okay? He's very clear here. Christians, you make it work. You have no excuse. You have godly counsel. You have forgiveness. You have repentance. You have reconciliation. Stay single or come back together again. And I know it gets complicated, and there's lots of complications here, but the general principle is Christians, make it work. Christian, non-Christian, it may not work. And if it doesn't, then you're not bound. what he says here is it is peace that we're called to. And domestic abuse is really one of the worst things and one of the most hidden things. And I don't think a home with domestic abuse is a home of peace. You see, so very possibly. That's what I would say. I believe that we can have a big discussion and a very fruitful discussion about divorce and remarriage once we understand the principles here. Because what Paul is doing is adding to the teaching of Jesus. He's bringing something alongside it, an understanding. Jesus, Paul says, is talking about those in the covenant. He was talking to Jews, those in the covenant, which today would be believers. I'm going to move on. Okay. What I have is what's here. You understand what I'm saying? There are so many variations on this theme that we could have, and I would be very happy to have a fruitful discussion. I think a discussion on that. But and I'll be very happy to arrange that. But I want to finish this chapter by 11 o'clock. Okay? Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't want to, because we're dealing with real issues now, aren't we? You know, this is kind of very close to home in many situations, and so let's get together and talk about it sometime. Okay. So he seems in the first part to be dealing with the marriage scenario, different kinds of marriage, and the basic principle he says is, he finishes up by saying, wife, for all you know, you might save your husband. Husband, for all you know, you might save your wife. What he's saying is, don't get divorced unless it really has to be, because that relationship, you may end up bringing your spouse to Christ. That's how he finishes up. A good reason to stay together. But then he goes on to say, basically, my principle is stay in whatever situation you are. Don't feel you have to change that. So if you're married, don't feel you have to get unmarried. You don't have to be unmarried and divorced. And he uses different examples here. If you're, this is really funny to me. 18. If anyone at the time of his call, was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Now, you kind of, how does that work, you know? But remember, in the Greek world, if you wanted to do athletics, men, you did it naked, which really saves on the laundry powder. You know, it doesn't help the soap, but it saves on the laundry powder. You know, that's how they would do it. So these things were very visible, and there is an operation, I understand, that can happen to cover over the marks of circumcision. And if you're not circumcised, don't be circumcised. And if you're a slave, don't be concerned about it. And if you're not a slave, don't go into slavery. No, he's using these examples as to be content with what you are, not feel you have to change your situation. And then he goes on to verse 25 and talks now about unmarried people. And there's two categories of unmarried people. And he says now concerning virgins, and I'm going to suggest to you that every time he uses the word virgin, he's talking about somebody who's engaged. And when he talks about the person who's not engaged, he simply says unmarried. Now, Air Translation sometimes uses the term fiancé. But when they do that, they are taking the word virgin and bringing an interpretation to that. I think an accurate interpretation, but that's what's happening here. So we've got different conditions of married people. Now we have conditions of single people, those that are engaged to be married, and those that are not engaged to be married. And he says, concerning virgins, I have no command of the Lord. Okay? So obviously something was going on. They were either asking questions or there was some sort of tension. He says, I have no command of the Lord, but I give my opinion as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. And this is what his view is. I think that in view of the either impending or present distress, crisis, it is well to stay single, not get married. Now, either he was thinking that the word can mean present or coming soon, this crisis. One of the other. It's one of those things. And it is well for you to remain as you are, because marriage can be more difficult when there's crisis and when there's distress. Winter, in his book, in his studies, speaks about how, about the time of the letter being written, there were 3 very, very acute grain shortages that were causing riots and problems around the Roman Empire. When you understand a bit about Roman society, and I'm talking about Rome now, one of the ways that Caesar kept the Roman people quiet, you remember, if you know the history, that it was a republic, and then it became controlled by like a dictator, and there was like this trade-off with the Roman people, that on the one hand they lost their freedom of engaging with the political system through the Senate, but what they got in return was the games and bread. And if you've seen Gladiator, the accuracy of that movie in many ways, I'm not talking about the storyline, but the Roman army and the way things happen, it is very, very accurate. The attitude people had towards these games and the giving out of bread and all this sort of thing. And so if ever there's a grain shortage, grain will be taken from around the Roman Empire and brought to Rome, because one of the things that Caesar wanted was to keep the people quiet and keep them happy. And so it could be talking about that, or it could simply be talking about persecution. And as you've been involved with the persecuted church or know stories of those who've been in persecution, pastors who've been in persecution, you know the scenario, don't you, of the pastor who is put in prison, and he knows that he has a wife and 5 children who have no possibility of any food because he's in prison. Now, that scenario would multiply the suffering, whatever they were doing to him. The fact he has a family, a wife and a family, out there with no means of support, would multiply the suffering he's going through 100-fold. And so, if this impending distress is talking about some sort of persecution, you can see the wisdom of what the Apostle Paul is saying. It comes out of a pastor's heart, not some mean ascetic monk. Because of what's going to happen, or what's happening, my advice is don't get married. You're better to stay as you are. Are you bound to a woman? Remember, woman, their translation unfortunately has wife. Are you engaged to a woman is probably the best way to read this. Do not seek to be free. Are you not engaged to a woman? Do not seek a woman, because his rule is just stay as you are right now. Don't feel you've got to change anything. If you do marry, you do not sin. Talking to the man. And if the virgin marries, she does not sin. Talking to the engaged woman. You get the balance again. Yet those who marry will experience distress in this life. Okay, that's a promise for you. Oh, hallelujah, I'm getting married. I wonder what the distress will be. To those who marry will experience distress in this life, and I would spare you that. You see, the whole focus here is his pastor's heart because of circumstances that were going on or were going to go on. And he wanted people to be free from that extra added pressure. I mean, brothers and sisters, the appointed time has grown short. From now on, let those who have wives be as though they have none, and let those who mourn as though they do not mourn, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they have no possessions, and those who deal with the world as though they have no dealings with it, for the present form of this world is passing away. And you can see by the catalogue of lists here that he's trying to give the principle that don't let anything become so big that it's going to consume you. The life is not about all these things we have. Because of the circumstances, nothing should become so big. You know, this isn't a command that we should not be happy. And this is not a command that from now onwards we should not be sad. You understand? Which, if you want to pick a verse out, it could be. The Apostle Paul says, I can't be happy, so I'm not going to be. Oh, I can't be sad either, so I'm going to be some middle-of-the-road, emotionless zombie. Because 1 Corinthians chapter 7 says so, and I read it in my SBS. See, it's more, don't let anything be so overwhelming that it takes up all your time and all your energy, because we have a calling on our lives. And life will happen, and all sorts of things will happen, but we have a calling on our life. And then he gets back to this thing about why he would suggest they be single or stay unmarried. I want you to be free from anxieties. So 2 reasons why he's arguing that they don't get married. One is the impending distress or the present crisis, whatever that is. And the second is free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the affairs of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about the affairs of the world and how to please his wife. And his interests are divided. The unmarried woman and the virgin, in other words, the unmarried woman and the engaged woman, are anxious about the affairs of the Lord, so that they may be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about the affairs of the world, how to please the husband. I say this for your benefit, not to put any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and unhindered devotion to the Lord. So that's really what it is. As a single man, he knew he had an availability to God that wouldn't be there if he was married. Can you imagine? Just imagine being married to the Apostle Paul. Hello, dear. How was your last 18 months? Oh, it was all right. Beaten, shipwrecked, put in prison. Really, it was nothing unusual. You know. Then imagine travelling with him. You see? And then, add on 4 or 5 children. You see the scenario building up here. You know, I stayed single rather longer than many people. I got married when I was 39, which was quite a while. And but there's a whole story there. But just to say, for a number of years, I was free to travel and do all sorts of things. And then got married, and we were still traveling some and doing what God called us. And then, the first baby comes along, and all of a sudden your travel experience changes. It's just wild, And that's, I'm sure for some cultures it doesn't make any difference. Strap the baby on the back and off you go, you know. But it's not like that. You have the car seat, and you have the baby carrier cot, and then you have all of the nappy things, and it just goes on and on. So all of a sudden you need this big truck to get to the airport, and it's all wrapped around this little bundle, this, you know. And I can imagine it wasn't like that for them, but you get the point, don't you? That Paul's passion here, he just was so into what God had called him to do. He had such a heart for his calling, and that was the filter with which he saw this. If you want to get married, it's fine, he says, but it's going to be more difficult because your attention's going to be divided, and we just know that's true. That's just the way life is. And then he goes on, finishing up. If anyone thinks that he's not behaving properly towards his fiancée, his virgin, and if his passions are strong, and it's inevitable, it has to be, let him marry as he wishes. It is no sin. Let them marry. So, and probably he's addressing the situation now. The couple who's asked the question maybe, or the man who's asking the question. And what he's saying, it comes back down to your calling, your ability, self-control, these kind of things. If the self-control is ruled not there, then get married. It's fine. You don't sin. Get married. But if anyone stands firm in his resolve, being under no necessity, but having his own desire under control, has determined his mind to keep her as his virgin or fiancée, he will do well. So, he who marries his fiancée does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do better. Okay? That's how he sums up. And the wife is bound as long as her husband lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes. May not be wise to marry anyone, but she's free to marry anyone, only in the Lord. In other words, the person needs to be a believer. Only in the Lord. But, in my judgment, she is more blessed to remain as she is. And I think that I too have the Spirit of God. So, as we look at this chapter, you can see he's dealing with issues in the church, probably questions that have arisen. Some of it has to do with bad thinking. You got the thinking that people are more spiritual if they divorce their husband and are single, because they're like angels in heaven, possibly, is what's going on. And the Apostle Paul, in one sense, agrees with them, but he agrees with them for a very different reason. It's not because it's more spiritual. It has to do with calling. And he can see being single is far more practical for him, and he can do so much more. But if you want to get married, you can. And if you are married, stay married. Unless it is really urgent that you get divorced because you're married to a non-Christian.